demand, which I feel like is an interesting thing to put in conversation with the idea of a right, right? Because some of the things that we were grappling with in the first context, a decolonized education. Oh my God. So this is a panel about fascism because I'm only hearing myself. Okay. Someone has to figure this out because it is creepy. I am not yet the Prime Minister. Okay. So I feel like it's interesting to think about demands because some of the things that we often demand from, especially the state, are made to seem impossible, right? Like the idea that the Supreme Court of India can recognize that a trans person has to change clothes and represent themselves in their most dignified way at the court and exit with dignity is impossible. The idea of a decolonized indigenous Adivasi education, the idea of Ambedkar being taught as a course in national law schools, it seems all impossible. And I feel like it's interesting what trans people demand. There is an interesting thing to think about in the panel about trans rights and democracy. It's easier to think about trans rights, but is there a trans democracy? And what does that look like? What does trans do to democracy, right? And perhaps, and one of the instant kind of provocations is precisely the right to self-determination, one that we exercise politically in terms of a vote and so on and so forth, but also in terms of everyday ordinary life, right? And so perhaps just kind of stating those questions that emerge from the panel, but the panel is really not going to be limited by this because I have 4 stellar people. If you see 3, there's one in the closet, that are joining us in this conversation, that I feel like will have more interesting things to say than my kind of slow mouth. So we have Kris, we have Kunal, we have Pushpesh, and we have Sayan joining us via the digital. You can look up their bios in the papers that have been handed, and on the YouTube page, I'm sure they'll link them. Because if you don't know them already, you're losers, and that's your problem. And so the order in which we're going to go is we're going to have Kunal first speak, then Pushpesh, then Kris, and finally Sayan. Each speaker will speak about 15 minutes. We're going to open it directly to the audience. I will let the first 5 questions in, and then no one gets a mic. Okay? So if you have a question, you better be ready with it. And then we'll just have about half an hour for that conversation to happen because I really do want the people we've got here to speak. With no further ado, Kunal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, all of you. I think I'm going to play the role of the boring lawyer on this panel. And a lot of the things that I want to talk about with this theme are to do with the nature of a particular kind of law, that is criminal law, which is what I work on. And I can understand that apart from a couple of lawyers that I can identify in the audience, I might lose all of you. So please, if that happens, then let me know by yawning or any other form of protest also that you may have. Right. So let me begin now. So what I want to really talk about is interrogate this idea of criminal law being playing a gatekeeping role to democratic rights, and how we are seeing that happen more and more often in today's political context. But it is by no means something that's recent. So the first thing that we need to acknowledge about law is that whether we like it or not, but law does play in society, or in most societies, a function that is double-faced. It's a Janus-faced function. And the more important one really is that it sets narratives or norms in place. That legal rules also are talking about not what just exists, but what the law imagines to exist in society, or imagines that should exist in society. So it has a double function there. It talks about regulation of what is, and also regulates what aspirations are acceptable, or what aspirations are recognized or achievable as well, right? And specifically, we see that in criminal law, this happens with three aspects. And I want to really look at how it interacts with sexuality and trans issues as well. We see that criminal law creates this gatekeeping function around three very critical aspects in society. These are what I call very unceremoniously and very inelegantly the gatekeeping around publics of society, the bodies in society, and relations in society. So we are talking about three. There could be more. This is not by no means supposed to be exhaustive, but criminal law plays an important role in regulating what is the public of this society and who has access to the public of society, right? So the first thing, let's say, which connects to a long-standing trans issue, has been take a law, which is a criminal law, which prohibits vagrancy or beggary, right, as it is called, which very critically locates this regulation as to who the public spaces, physical spaces in a city or in a town belong to. How do you manifest yourself in a public? And it's that certain people cannot manifest what they want to do in the public. If they do it, they are asking for criminal regulation. Or the criminal law makes those public spaces inaccessible to certain identities, certain forms of behavior, right? It also interconnectedly says you cannot perform certain roles in public spaces. So, for example, with regard to colonial and even post colonial regulation of certain traditional, let's say, professions, right? We have a very clear criminal regulation that something counts as vagrancy, something counts as criminal nuisance, and something else does not. And there is a politics of what is an acceptable profession and a non-acceptable profession there. The second gatekeeping function, which we see very clearly, and I don't really need to go too much into it, is the gatekeeping over bodies, right? And of course, we all have seen the long shadow of Section 377, which was most specifically regulating bodies and bodily conduct. We are seeing repercussions of the same thought process or same belief. So you have, of course, now something which regulates reproduction, right? And access to ART, the technologies of reproduction. You also have, and this is an interesting aspect as well, what bodies are not regulated by the benign function of criminal law. So where do you ask for protection? The law of rape, for example, right? Who it excludes, who it includes in its standard definitions, etc. Again, gatekeeping the idea of what can be done to a body, what the body can be used for, what the body can produce, etc., etc. Right? Sex work is another example as well. And finally, you have the gatekeeping of relations between people. So you could talk about the structure of family law, the ensuring that family law has a bite to it by always reading it together with criminal law makes it a criminal law issue as well. So things such as maintenance are very often in magistrate courts criminal law issues, right? So who is entitled to all of this? So we see a paradox here. And the paradox is that in criminal law, and I hope I've not lost all of you together already, the paradox is a simultaneous invisibility and a hyper visibility that the law confers. I'm not the first person to say this. Work has been done on this in the past as well. But what you essentially see is a hyper visibility on aspects of law that criminalize, that impose liability. There you are the chosen target. Your form of expression is the chosen expression which will lead to liability. But where it comes to protection of the law, right, then you are invisible, right? So you don't get protection under the normal criminal law structures that are otherwise available to others. The law of rape is a good example of this. You get a very watered down acceptance or visibility much later. So you have something called abuse in the Transgender Act, but you know that that's not rape, and therefore you don't know where your protection is. The law is unclear, right? Invisibilization can happen much more clearly, which is, of course, that something like the ART bill will say that you just are disentitled for some kinds of procedures, right? Otherwise available, right? We can, let's say, further the example a bit. So you see a visibility in terms of a Nalsa judgment and a simultaneous invisibility in its enforcement in statutory law, right? So there again you see this dichotomy. It's as if where you are a right-holding citizen, the law treats you as invisible, but where you are a citizen who can be governed and potentially put in jail, you are very visible, right? Let's take another example, the NRC, right? So the NRC and trans issues with the NRC of documentation and the impossibility of documentation, invisible, even to the law most clearly, and also sometimes in public discourse, right? But it's right there. So where again a potential liability or a loss of statehood can happen, you are invisible to the law here, right? Now, so if we look at this entire structure, and I'll not take too much time, what you see is in this entire governance module through the law, we started with this idea that law creates norms. And law in society also feeds into this idea of what is acceptable, what is non acceptable, what is imagined, and what is unimagined. It becomes impossible, therefore, to look at certain communities, trans communities, and imagine them as full citizens of the law, as full subjects of the law. Because the law is constantly playing this game where, on a question of what rights are to be conferred, you're not imaginable at all. But on a question of what liabilities are to be imposed, you're the usual suspect in that sense, right? In criminal law, this becomes even more interesting because you also see a particular aspect of punitiveness that is attached to criminal law. And criminal law has for long been content with excluding you either directly or criminalizing you directly, right? But now in a right where everyone is forced to adopt a rights based language, at least a new phenomenon can be seen to be developing, which is a criminal law that is punitive by implication, right? It does not target you specifically in a sense that it does not say something about you, but by implication what happens is that you are targeted. And this, I want to connect this to this idea of democracy or a demand of democratic rights, etc. If you see modern criminal law in this country today, what is essentially happening is that from a non-subject, if you demand to be treated as a subject, criminal law is the gatekeeper to that as well. It punishes that. So if you go protest the NRC, if you go protest the CAA, there is the criminal law that will take care of you, right? The demand itself can substantively be valid. The government will never say, never accept that it is depriving people of citizenship, but it will ensure that by implication citizenship cannot be secured. And this is a function that is made possible through the criminal law only. It is the criminal law here that is serving as a barrier to you exercising a kind of democratic right. Let's call it the right to protest if you want to call it something. But I would say this right of being itself, right? Which the criminal law says that you can't ask for. And if you ask for it, then deal with the entire heavy hand of the state, and then let's see what rights have to be given to you. All in all, again, to go back to this dichotomy and this double-facedness, in theory, granting you everything that you are asking for. So in theory, the government has protected transgender people because it has passed an act, right? Simultaneously doing this as well. I had one more point, after which I will stop. So
I will make you otherwise.
all right. Yeah. So it connects, and this is my last one, sorry. It connects to this idea of a citizenship by design, is what I would like to call it, where you're seeing that our society and our legal system is deliberately shifting to this punitive mechanism. Our discourse today around crime is around punitiveness. We want to know how better we can punish, how more we can punish, how we can punish so that they don't commit a crime again, etc., etc. And in this idea of increasing punitive behavior of the law, it is fundamentally incompatible with an inconvenient demand that might be made by certain citizens or might be made by certain people. Also added to this is that this punitiveness is connected to the fact that, again, to look at the law as a norm creating and a norm following institution is created to the idea of who is it that punitiveness is meant to protect, who is it that punitiveness is meant to punish. And very clearly, if you fall within a certain structure of identity, then you are entitled to the protection of law. And if you fall outside it, then law serves as that gatekeeper which does not let you in. Last thing is that the idea of the gatekeeper is not mine. This was said by Camus, actually, of looking at law and the institutions of law as gatekeepers that entitle or disentitle you to certain things. With that, I'll stop.
Thanks, Kunal, and especially for keeping time, because I'm the fastest. I want to leave the provocation here so that you have something to think about while other people are also talking. And then before I move to Pushpesh, is I'm thinking about this kind of your need to kind of think about democracy by sight or by the eye, especially when the law is seen to be blind, right? And so there's a kind of a more permanent contradiction in what you're saying about the law's inability to see. And this, I feel like, is challenged by trans persons, particularly by both the need to speak up and speak out. So communities are asked to speak to the law rather than be seen by the law. But also the other ways in which trans people actually talk to each other, which is, say, for example, the clap or the use of Farsi, etc., where we don't actually rely so much on sight and so on. So I'm thinking about what are the limits of a democracy based on sight and seeing itself, and that one might want to think about. And the second, I just want to think about also that that we might want to think about the not just stop at punitive, but actually call out cruelty, right? And so because the punitive still has a kind of recognition that it is in the legal framework itself, whereas what happens to GN Sai Baba, what happens to San Swami, what happens to trans persons who are taken to carceral institutions is precisely humiliation and cruelty, right? It's not simply punitive, because the punitive has a certain kind of measure and regard that seems democratic. And I feel like I want to push your language there. Pushpesh, the floor is yours. Go there, please. Oh, madam.
I'm sorry.
Lovely.
Just remove my mouse. At the outset, I want to express my thankfulness to the organizer for having me here, but I am equally scared to speak amidst this audience because I think when I heard the conversation in the first session, I thought there's a lot of learning from me here than what I'm going to share. Many of the things which I'm going to talk about is almost known to everyone, but the only thing I'm doing is I'm going to put the things in perspective. So I begin with the premise that NALSA and post 377, what has happened is a sharp division between queer subject have begun to surface, and how within this division we try to locate the trans right in India and elsewhere. So they have begun to surface with trans subjects left to fight their own existential battle, while privileged queer articulate a homonormative and a homonationalistic uh, aspirations, and it becomes difficult for the isolated trans communities. I'm not underestimating the trans communities, but I'm just reminding, when Patricia Oberoy, she's a sociologist, is talking about the middle class's guiltless consumption, when the post-globalization happening, and then new cinema is coming. For example, Madhuri Dixit, Hum Aapke Hain Kaun, and then in our generation, for example, then she's talking about this, the song sequence which talks about chocolate, lime juice, Meri Sahelia. So there's a guiltless consumption. So she will eat chocolate, she will have lime juice and everything. All those things, and if you see the dogs and whatever menu is served, etc., in a family context, the whole labor process is being hidden, etc., etc. So what is the duty of middle class towards the working class? She's sort of trying to remind. So here I'm also trying to remind what is the duty of the privileged queer towards the most disprivileged queer community, and what is happening today. and that was really surfaced prominently during the COVID-19 pandemic. The division appears somewhat similar to those between working and lower middle class and the privileged classes in India. The media visuals of upwardly mobile middle classes and affluent families enthusiastically beating thalis and lighting lamps upon Prime Minister calls showing national solidarity and acknowledged contributions of frontline workers kept circulating during the pandemic lockdowns in April, March 2020, March, April, giving this occasion an aura of mass festive rituals. Parallel to this, the trauma and precarity of migrant workers, daily wage earners, street vendors, small shop owners continue to multiply and escalate. While the market offered designer masks and immunity boosters, to affluent consumers, sorry, and the business of leading pharmaceutical companies swelled with profiteering. The domestic workers and people in low-paid jobs bore the brunt of lockdown and other regulatory measures enforced by local authorities. Though life turned difficult for many women and queer persons, the most visible impact of pandemic was witnessed on the livelihood and existence of transgender communities. Transgender persons living both inside and outside the community life faced existential problem of food, medicine, transitioning and therapy, loss of sources of income and livelihood with very minimal state support. They would mostly survive through community support and the help rendered through NGOs and voluntary organizations to a limited extent. The mainstream media barely captured their plight. The Amnesty International surmised, as the world comes together, India's transgender community fight COVID alone. Posters were stuck in city of Hyderabad, for example, warning people not to talk to transgender person in case they contact coronavirus. This led to housing complexes asking transgender person to vacate their rented accommodation. Facing intensified stigma and transphobia under the pandemic, the community wrote to Ministry of Finance, Home Affairs, and Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, urging immediate attention, considering their acute hardships. They demanded an assured subsistence income of 3,000 per month. So, while this precarity was triggered by pandemic and its several lockdown phases, how does one understand the simultaneous filing of cases for rights to marry or marriage equality in Delhi High Court by certain gay and lesbian persons during the pandemic? With marriage rights for some, while loss of livelihood and precarity for others, is it pertinent to explore the priorities of divided queer groups in pandemic situation? It is equally important to ask whether the privileged queer filing cases in Delhi High Court for marriage equality have expressed any concern towards transgender persons' vulnerabilities. Following the court case hearing towards legalizing same-sex marriage, many supporters took to Twitter with hashtag HomoVivah, same-sex marriage. The term vivah suffixed with homo is Sanskritized term, a formal Hindu expression for wedding. There are queer persons from Muslim, Dalit, Christian, and many other communities who may not identify with the term vivah, as someone intervened on the Twitter storm Homo Vivah, why not Homo Nikah? For those minority queer persons, aspiring amendment of personal laws regulating their identity, marriage, property, and divorce, Homo Vivah appeared alienating and estranging, although marriage itself sounds unreasonable and normativizing for others. With hindsight, I submit that the same-sex marriage might become desirable for financially independent, individualistic, affluent queer person who, through their class positioning and financial security, can undermine and transcend community, caste, ethnic, racial, and even national boundaries, as many of our Adivasi trans sisters were articulating. It matters to them, but it doesn't matter to this privileged class of queer who can transcend those boundaries. In the Western context, for example, race and class privilege allow specific categories of queer to emulate dominant middle class norms of marriage and family, engendering normalization of queer identity and its simultaneous depoliticization, offering itself to assimilation within an affluent middle class consumptive culture. So, whereas trans people are pushing for democratization and pushing for politicization, there is an intensive politicization we are witnessing in contemporary India of trans constituencies. You will see these privileged queer are happy with the civil rights. If the civil rights gets, and civil rights privatizes the politics, it relegates into the private background. So if I am married, the state leaves you. You are married, you take care of yourself. But here the trans communities are constantly asking the state to give us this. ensure this, institutionalize this, commit to Nalsa judgment, whereas the privileged queer are happy with the civil rights, the marriage rights. The critical queer perspective entails a diversity of queer lives and somewhat unsettled and unstable myriad ways of celebrating intimate relations and alternative kinship to pose a challenge to normative, monogamous, and patriarchal heteronormative intimacy and kinship arrangement. The equality advocates emphasize that marriage is a way of mainstreaming and normativizing queer communities at both state and society upholds marriage as moral and superior human bond. Class and cultural privilege of those who filed cases for same-sex marriage, one can see, for majority of can be contrasted with the majority among the queer communities. While the transgender community's existential battle throughout the ongoing pandemic for the privileged queer, what mattered were civil rights, ensuring conjugality, inheritance, property rights, insurance nomination available to heterosexual citizens, read middle class. Andrew Sullivan, the anti-left face of gay movement in the US, urges the LGBT communities to move in the direction of homogeneity and to become more mainstream. Sullivan claims that in the years past, it was important for gays to rebel, but now gay marriage also places more responsibilities upon gays. It says that for the first time, that gay relationships are not better or worse than a straight relationship, and the same is expected of them. It's clear and dignified. To Sullivan, idealizing gay marriage would offer homosexuals the same deal society now offers to heterosexuals. A related argument advanced by those who take assimilationist position is that same-sex marriage, like the major function of heterosexual marriages, would allow for raising children in a stable and socially sanctioned, highly functional and economically viable setting. If one takes this position, then single and unwed mothers, female-headed households, single queer and transgender person might become disqualified for rearing and raising children. And that's what my friend has talked about, that reproductive rights and all that, and right to adoption. The oppositional position on same-sex marriage emphasizes that entering into monogamous marriage world amount to participation in patriarchal, oppressive, state-governed institution of marriage, creating new hierarchies within queer communities, with the highest tier reserved for those cushioned by marriage and further marginalize those who choose alternate. And the state will not be committed and responsible. They will say, now you've got marriage rights. You marry and you're fine, like heterosexual people. So trivializing the non-monogamous relation through a holistic, restrictive version of morality. So they are also trying to institutionalize a restrictive version of morality through monogamy. I go to American context also and take a comparative study of middle class suburb of Maplewood, New Jersey, and its close, much larger and much maligned post-industrial urban cousin, Newark, that offers a clear illustration that queer people of color are, for a variety of reasons, including lack of access to capital, greater embeddedness in non-nuclear family and networks, feeling of loyalty to and belonging to racial ethnic minority groups, fear of stigma, and higher rates of religiosity, among others, are less likely than their white middle-class counterparts to make sexuality a primary identity. And as many of the sisters who are from Adivasi background have been, sexuality cannot be a primary identity. There are other issues which are simultaneous, and we need to talk about, there is a simultaneity related to the existence. Maplewood's affluent middle-class gays and lesbian, a fair chunk of whom have got into civil unions, want their neighbors to recognize them as different, but also similar, as members of family-oriented middle class. They also want the state to grant them legal rights and economic benefits enjoyed by their heterosexual neighbor. So you can see, in contrast, the poverty-stricken Newark, the queer of color, consider marriage as a luxury and consider safe street, decent jobs, and access to quality health as priorities. So I'll not get into the many details of this. So I would say that elopements, unsuccessful attempts at marrying and escaping the tyranny of family and kinship by queer person did exist in post-colonial India, Photos of a few pompous and affluent gay weddings would emerge in times of in time, at times in glossy magazines and web giants for upmarket and executive class of readership. However, in post 377 India, what is new is an emphasis on legalization and demand for marriage equality vis-a-vis heterosexual married majority. What most concerned us is the petitioner's upwardly mobile, affluent middle class status and the grounds on which marriage equality is justified. Did the marriage legalization reasoning of petitioners concern the majority of transgender person in a pandemic context? The right to marriage would constitute civil rights without responsibilizing to the state regarding financial and infrastructural commitments. In contrast, the right to food, medicine, livelihood, access to gender affirming needs, and HIV/AIDS treatment would require allocating and distributing those resources to the underclass. This specific temporality of corona pandemic revealed differing priorities of two different classes of queer, one seeking legality of marriage parallel to heterosexual couples. The more subaltern transgender person were struggling to get a fair hearing from the state. They wanted their daily meals and modicum of an institutional mechanism to safeguard their emergency. Now I'll talk about the privileged queer class, and then I'll stop. I may have some time. There is no denying that the privileged classes of queer do have issues and problems compelling them to petition in the High Court for marriage legalization. Kavita Arora and Ankita Khanna, the two mental health professionals, are living together for past 8 years as partners. They filed a case in Delhi High Court in October 2020, citing the constitutional provision of justice and non-discrimination, while highlighting their difficulties in opening a joint bank account as a couple, in nominating a same-sex partner in the insurance policy, gratuity and pension, and applying for a passport. They invoked right to marry through a Special Marriage Act. The case of Kavita and Ankita was filed through Arundhati Karchu and Survidhar and argued in court by Menika Guruswamy. While joint bank accounts and insurance nomination and owning an apartment together are undisputed, the question is, why should marriage and conjugality be considered the only basis to claim them legally? What also concerned us is the middle classness of the couple, their photos on media reflecting the aesthetic and sartorial sophistication, their status as mental health professional, and their foreign travel aspirations. Moreover, their case is filed and represented by two globally known women same-sex partners who made headlines in 2018 through their active role in reading down of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, criminalizing homosexuality. Karju and Guruswamy are affluent, have their legal education from the world's most prestigious universities, and constitute probably the role models for certain upwardly mobile same-sex person aspiring to get married and lead a consumptive, comfortable lifestyle. Kavita and Ankita in popular writings are described through unbreakable bond of two people who have come together in love. They are like any other couple you might meet. Their anxieties during the first wave of corona pandemic were described. While projecting the couple as victims of discriminatory law, the authors of such articles tacitly reinscribed conjugality and monogamy as superior to other intimacies and partnership. Jack Halberstam associates queer existence with wilderness. He theorizes the wild as an unbounded, unpredictable space that offers source of opposition to modernity's orderly impulses. While the unpredictability of life during pandemic compels Kavita and Ankita to think of entitlements such as joint bank account, insurance, inheritance, nomination, visitation right. What remains is in the background is monogamy, bounded love, aspired conjugality, and of course entitlements parallel to heterosexual monogamous couples. Menika Guruswamy and Arundhati Karju, who filed and represented the case of Kavita and Ankita, speak of their marriage rights advocacy mission as marriage project. They were talking in their Oxford University when they were invited to talk about. They said that their project is called Marriage Project, citing this as central to Indian society. And they're also saying that marriage is central to Indian society. This implies that marriage is the most crucial gateway for LGBT acceptance in Indian society. In the Oxford Unity Society's invited speech following the decriminalization of homosexuality in India, Guruswamy proclaims, "We Indian are a marriage society." In Guru Swami's speech, there is a complete erasure of feminist and queer critiques on marriage being discussed and debated in India. Marriage inter alia is associated with dowry, domestic violence, unequal work burden, restriction on women's mobility, endogamy, which reproduces exploitative caste structure in India, Kaju and okay. So Kaju and Guruswamy are tight-lipped and underplays these concerns in their formal speech. Suppose entitlements of, so I will not get into these details. So you see the two different worlds of trans communities, majority trans communities, and these privileged queer. So in the feminist movement, it is also said that when any movement is starting, how the energies of women are harnessed within the movement, right? And when it comes to power sharing, the women are relegated to the background. So trans communities have always been at the forefront, the Hijra communities and trans, hyper visible, as my friend has talked about, the hyper visibility of these entities in the LGBTQI movement right from the beginning. And the movement stands on the back of trans communities. But when it comes to fighting together a battle and pressurizing the state to ensure the provisions, at least within the Nalsa judgment, even if there is a lot of limitations of Nalsa judgment, the language, and there are other problems from Foucauldian perspective. Many critics have critiqued it, the third gender category, etc., which it reinscribes. But at the same time, it is also a document of substantive justice, and the state is faltering to translate it into practice. So these privileged queer and all queer communities have to come together when they have fought the reading down of section 377 together. And where are they now? They're talking about marriage, and in the pandemic, they're not even showing an iota of concern to the trans communities. And definitely there is an intersectionality within trans, and certain categories of trans people are also being co-opted by the state, and they are also within the assimilationist politics. And in this context, how do we imagine trans rights in India? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Pushpesh. I feel like there'll be a lot more conversation about what you've raised also in the next panel, which is trying to think about love in this way. My only kind of query is when you're thinking about the duty of privileged queers to working class trans people, and you're correct to point out that there are privileged trans persons who are very much on this bandwagon. So it would be the working class trans person and not just all trans persons. I'm thinking about the idea of duty itself in this kind of framework. And I'm thinking about what does it mean to ask us to move from a rights-based citizen subject to a duty-informed moral subject, right? And if the privileged queers are being asked to show up for trans persons, I'm wondering what are the limitations of the moral world of the Savarna? Just myself included, right? The Savarna moral world is actually a very constrained moral world in which it will always be conditional for trans persons to be accepted. So I'm wondering, can a moral subject actually hold the conversation for a trans democracy? And I want to kind of leave you with that thought, and maybe we'll come back to that. Kris, floor is yours.
Hello. Yeah. Okay. Wow. There's a lot that's already the two of them have covered. And I don't think I'm going to say anything new beyond that, to be very honest. Actually, the topic of this, demand for transgender rights and democracy. So the thing is, the fact that we have to demand rights is very absurd to me in itself, and I think everyone finds that absurd. Because, how do I say this? Because, and we've talked about this a lot, where the identity of a transgender person, as we see right now in our country, is an exclusionary category, irrespective of the rights we have, article, whatever. It's still an exclusionary right to be able to identify in this country as a transgender person legally, comes from an exclusionary law that's outside of it. You're not naturally recognized as who you are, and inherently puts us as an exceptional category. It is automatically outside. It's like when you are a citizen, when you are a person in this country, and which naturally comes with its rights, what then, okay, when you are naturally a citizen of this country, with it comes rights, but then what happens when you are an exclusionary category? Is there a question of demand? Because who are we demanding this from? We are consistently negotiating with the state. I mean, like, our daily existence has been a negotiation. Each and every conversation, whether it be in the previous panel or the ones that we're going to have, is a negotiation. Our daily lives are a negotiation. Whether it be education, healthcare, etc., where uh, we're trying to find loopholes, we're trying to make it work, we're trying to get new policies, etc., in place to find space, right? And that being our space, that being a space in the larger terms of the democracy, when we talk about the state in terms of the country, right? Um, but also, what I wanted to talk about was the implications of our negotiation with the state, with how we work, negotiation with the state, negotiation with democracy, and how we as a quote unquote community work with democracy. Um, we always talk about trans community, LGBTQ community, and of course, there have been a lot of conversations on what this idea of community itself means. Does it mean anything? You could call it solidarities, but what exactly it means, which is why I wanted to talk about pride here, because taking that as an example, for a lot of like metropolitan cities, etc., as a space where you are actively seeing quote unquote community organization, seeing people um, foot on ground, trying to organize, trying to get together, be it for visibility, be it for whatever purpose, and pride as that site of organization. And what does that actually reveal about how we are seeing democracy within this quote unquote community? We all know the history of where pride came from, and clearly the way, especially our Indian metropolitan cities, the pride we see is way further away from that. Most likely, we see pride as a celebration now, which I don't know what we are celebrating, to be very honest, with the act and everything that we have right now. Especially as a trans person, I genuinely don't know what we are celebrating. Which is also a question, right? Because this space that is a pride is not just for a trans person, it is LGBTQI alphabet soup. And and the idea of that pride has always been of coming together, solidarity, or I don't know, organization. um, but within that, we can also find state. And because we as people would reflect how our negotiation and the impact that state has on us, and state in terms of government or bureaucracy, how that implementation comes into our organization as well, and our democracy as well. And it's been very not very prominent, but it's been visible. Be it in Calcutta Pride a few years ago, where there were hassles with conducting with Pride on, you can't do this, you can't walk here, you can't do this. Or very recently, Pune Pride, where people who cross-dress were not allowed. Conversations on who this year, conversations on, can you organize a Pride? Can a collective organize a Pride? Or can another group who's never done this before, can they organize Pride as well? Who has the ownership of organization of a community then? I actually can only speak from the perspective of my experience with Bombay Pride, because that's where I have been. And so Bombay Pride has also been a similar space. It's a collective of people. And but the idea is, again, democracy and access, right? About who has the ability to represent themselves, who has the information and access to be in that space, which again comes, as Pushpesh said, privileged queers being able to know of each other. I think most importantly, of knowing of each other. the whole idea of community is that we automatically know each other, and if I have any problem, I get to talk to another queer or trans person. Does not happen realistically. At the end of the day, when you come out as a trans person or a queer person, you're most likely going to, most of the time, be an individual trying to figure out your space in this democracy and this society. So this access to come together, this access to be seen, to see other trans people, to communicate with them, and so that's a question of access, and that is something that we've been riddled with, and we've not exactly, because we're talking about trans democracy, we've not figured out that as a community either. And because that's also right, because you're talking about, if the law recognizes XYZ as trans person and this does not, and it gives definitions by the NALSA, what we as a community also, or like, I think a mainstream community would be a better way to put it. Who do we recognize as a trans person as well? Do we actually understand, or do we actually practice that self-determination? And my perspective on that comes from in the last 3 years that I've been working within my city, trying to build a collective independent of mainstream organizing of queer people, trying to build a community outside of that, where the idea is not central to your need as a trans person, or the discrimination that you face or your trouble. It's more of a space for joy, more for a space to be seen, because I think being seen as a trans person or being seen as a queer person within that community holds a lot of power in itself. So that is how I am seeing that collective or community organization. So coming back to the point of mainstream collective organizing, it's also a conversation on power, because I'm not sure if NGOization is the right word here, but that is very much apparent when you talk about mainstream organizing, and which is a very gate-kept space, obviously. And there has been what happens with that gate-kept space is, I think, like Christy was talking about, the expert and the beneficiary, where a mainstream space that is organized is the experts. They know what is good for the trans community. They know what is good for the queer community. They will do XYZ programs. We are doing the research. And a lot of queer and trans people who have not found that space to be seen as one within this space. What about them? What of that voice? Does that person not have a voice? Or are we not seeing it? Or are we not hearing it? So that's where I think the finding the voice thing comes, right? It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of... but then within that, and what I've experienced personally within that space of like trying to find that voice, or trying to... it's come from a lot of privilege, obviously. The privilege to be able to gate crash these spaces, to put my foot in the door, to try to find this voice. But my experience has been things like, you can't get away with playing the trans card everywhere, are things that are said to you. A lot of time, most of the times, as a non-binary person, the onus or the responsibility of explaining your identity, justifying your existence, I would put it as, is obvious. It's put on you. You're not a person standing here expressing your issue or your need or your right. You need to justify the same. And that, of course, comes into queer organizing, because it's not just, we're not organizing just because we're queer people or we're trans people. everyone here also has other affiliations with them, be it your university, be it your workspace, be it your caste location. There is a lot of privilege that comes from other than from your identity, irrespective of your queerness and transness, which itself obviously would contribute to your contribute to the hierarchy of the um, to queer organizing. And that's the question, right? That's why we come back to that question of, like, if it's a democracy, and how are we seeing it as a democracy when we are talking about leadership? And are we talking about inclusion, or are we only talking about leadership? Are we talking about majority of people? If you're talking about majority of people, what about the people who don't have the right to be seen as well, who we do not um, we do not recognize as a trans person, which kind of sounds absurd, because we essentially always talk about self-determination, because self-determination sounds nice, where not nice, I mean, self-determination is a very important aspect, but when we are trying to find space, it's often about the other person seeing you as well, like other group of people seeing you as well, which has been very um, which has been kind of an issue when we talk about trans communities and organizing. um, just give me 1 second.
Take two.
Yeah, so basically the reason why I'm talking about this being an issue is because, as of now, as I said, mainstream organizing has only been around services. Um, I understand, and it's completely valid that this is because we're talking about discrimination, we're talking about rights. So services that trans people require, be that medical, legal, etc., etc. But are but organizing beyond services, but organizing for the purpose of the idea of community or kinship. Like, are we organizing for that kinship, or are we organizing for a particular service? But because how far is provision of a service going to take us? Is it going to fulfill any idea of a demand? That's clearly not happening. And it's also, the question of this organization also comes together because it's also about rights beyond us just being a trans person. It's our rights with regards to citizenship, or it's our rights with regards to horizontal reservation. These are demand for rights that we have irrespective of being trans. It comes from our other identities. And when we try to talk about that, when trying to organize around that, we are not seeing that organization, that trans organization anymore, which we generally see when it comes to services. Essentially, because our organizing is mostly around services, right? Um, um, One place where I have found very joy-inducing getting together kind of organizing, which leads to much more things, including services. Uh, Comes from a space of privilege, but has been this online space in the last 2 years. I was just talking to, there are people here who I've known for 2 years and have been great friends, but I've not met them. We've been able to organize, we've been able to be there for each other. People have contacted us, we've done things that we've never met. It's not been for a service, but there's still been a sense of community. And this probably does not, actually more kinship than community. But then that organization, as a kinship as well, has translated into services eventually for a common cause. We've been able to come together to do that. That's been the conversation on mutual aid. That's what we've been doing. So when you talk about trans democracy, not that I actually only have questions. I think everything I've been saying has just been questions. Where in the last 2 years, I've been thinking about if it is possible that a trans person who has been actively working for organizing for like something as big as a pride can be so easily excluded with a trans card. Like you can't play the trans card everywhere. Where, as Pushpesh talked about homonationalism as well, where that kind of power is also brought in to that space. How is trans organization or like trans democracy, or that's what our imagination of how are we bringing that trans, quote unquote, transness together? Or is that a factor that brings us together? Or how do we do that? That's a question. I don't really know about it, to be honest. But that's pretty much my thought on democracy. Trans democracy.
Thanks, Kris. I'm quite you're kind of, for us, at least in the way in which I understand it, trying to push democracy as a framework beyond the state, right? And so not looking at the state, when you're saying who do we ask these rights from and where do we look for democracy, to not constantly kind of front the state as the provider of democracy. So I think that's an interesting kind of provocation. And the other, I think, but the other that it is tied to is to escape the Savarna world of the exception. I'm kind of, it seems deeply narcissistic that as a Savarna person I speak about Savarna so much, but that is also the Savarna world. Here is a performative contradiction. But kind of the exceptional is always kind of also the arbiter of democracy, right? So the poor Brahmin, right? The trans woman who got rich begging, the Dalit person who happens to be a millionaire. Our democracy itself is no longer a state of exception, but a state of the exceptional, right? In which the exceptional is by which we understand democracy, right? So, in fact, where do we go from this kind of quandary of the Savarna world itself? And I would be interested in kind of hearing your thoughts about that, if at all any, and you can ignore my Savarna question also. On that note, Sayan, we have joining us through the internet and sitting in very, very cold United States. Hi, Sayan, a warm welcome to Transform. I hope you can hear us and we can see you. So 15 minutes. I can't pass you a note. You better be well behaved. Otherwise, we'll revoke your citizenship. And okay? Perfectly. Can people at the back hear Sayan? Say something again.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah, we can all hear you.
Great. So, of course, it's always a dream to be sharing the platform with Vqueeram, but that's kind of unfulfilled because I'm not there. But then I'm not even in Minnesota, I'm in Kolkata. For all kinds of health-related reasons, I couldn't make it. So apologies for that, and it's my loss entirely. I miss meeting my friend Shripad, whose mustard yellow sari I got a glimpse of in the last panel. I saw them sitting at the back. Thanks a lot to CLPR for organizing these conversations, and thanks for being so accommodating and allowing me to be on Zoom here. I apologize in advance for some background noise. There's a person relentlessly coughing in the other room while the house is being torn down in the neighborhood. So there's real estate, health, everything going on as we are talking about democracy and transness. And whatever I'm going to talk about today is kind of from some recent encounters and conversations that I've been having over the last few months. And not really a coherent set of comments, but more like thoughts. So it's very interesting to hear Kris and their critique of services, and I'm completely on board with them, but I am starting from a position of services, and hopefully at some point, but through services, I want to kind of reach that moment of agreement with Kris. So specifically, what I have been thinking about is where are the elderly in all our conversations on trans democracy. And in my personal capacity, like there are a few of us, an organization and a couple of individuals. Now, when I say individual, of course, nobody is an individual. There are infrastructures which enable us to do things. We have been looking after a group of elderly trans persons, and we will be there in a couple of decades. So it's not any favor being done, but what I'm basically going to talk about are a series of bottlenecks that we have been facing in kind of providing this care. So one particular incident, this particular person who is 65 years old, partially paralyzed, and we've been looking after her. And but at the same time, the expenses are increasing, right? And even though we are in the middle of the pandemic, still there is this illusion that's being created that we are in the post of the pandemic, which is to say that funds are drying up. So during the first two waves of the pandemic, there were a series of fundraisers, and NGOs which had unused funds could you do some creative accounting and channel those funds into emergency relief, raising rations. But that kind of those kind of funds have started drying up. So then where do we stand today? Because the needs are not disappearing anywhere, right? And so that is where I want to highlight this question of services and this kind of dichotomy that is created between services and rights. So to give some concrete examples, and this is something that I've witnessed firsthand, during the first and the second wave, when a lot of organizations were raising resources to give ration kits to the homeless and the destitute and trans person, as if those identities don't intersect. Have we had many conversations on the quality of the rice grains? So the moment we think of food as a service and not connected to the question of right to dignity, right to nourishment, right to a balanced diet, therefore that division comes into play, whereby an NGO can feel complacent giving coarse grains to the recipients, right? And so many organizations across the country which have been running these massive fundraisers to raise to basically buy rations, there hasn't really been many conversations on the quality of the ration kits. And now even those kits have resources have started dwindling. That's one point. And so then that question of, is it really, can we think of service as not service, but as a right? And then connected to that question is some recent conversations where funders are saying that we cannot provide funding for purchasing medicines any longer. That was an emergency period, and therefore we were making those provisions, but no longer. That's not possible anymore. So then here we are with a structure whereby all the labors get individualized, and care is decided based on personal equations and not care as a right of every person, because there are no structures in place where care can be demanded as a right. So, for instance, if we look at what the complete lack of structures, if we just go a little deeper into that, we have the Trans Act, and then we have this the National Council for Trans Persons, right? And these Garima Grihas, oddly titled Garima Grihas, Garima roughly meaning dignity, I guess. But then these Garima Grihas, these shelter homes across the country that have come up. If we really look at the kind of infrastructures that they have been given, in the eligibility criteria, it says that the age limit is between 18 and 60. Now, of course, what happens to those beyond 60? And then in the second eligibility criteria, it says that the trans persons who can be the of these garima grihas cannot be sex workers and cannot be involved in begging, right? So then again, that question of service and right comes in, because here is this home, shelter home, which is titled the dignity home, but it does not recognize dignity of labor, and it sees itself as a service provider whereby inmates come there for a fixed period of time, and then they are imparted with skill development courses, training, and then at the end of a year they will have to basically move out and implement those skill development training that they have picked from the Garima Griha, and apply it in the real world. Now, what are the kind of skill development training that's happening here? Now, if one goes to the website, we only see a lot of photographs of the persons living there, cooking, knitting, and thread work, tailoring. Basically, just reminding one of the charity-based Nari Niketans that have been functioning in the country for such a long time, which don't really run by feminist principles, but more in terms of the idea of seva, right? So it's not really about labor; it's about and because the moment one talks in terms of labor, then the question of rights and dignity and democracy come up. But then that is not the idea. The idea is one of service provisions. So now, in all this skill development process, someone who is 65 years old, who is partially paralyzed, is not a productive person, right? It's not a productive citizen to be part of this kind of a framework. So definitely, such a person does not have space in this kind of a quote unquote dignity home, right? So the organization, myself, who have been looking after who have been kind of caretakers of these people, we have had conversations with these Garima Grihas, quite a few of them. Like the city of Calcutta, Kolkata has two Garima Grihas. One of the Garima Grihas said that their kitchen is on the third floor, and the bedrooms are on the ground floor. And so obviously that precludes the possibility of a partially paralyzed person to be in that shelter home. If not, if some kind of allowances were to be made in terms of the outer limit of age, but the very architecture of the building does not allow the possibility, does not imagine access, right? So then that is ruled out. With the second Garima Griha, the reasoning was a little more complicated, because we don't have these, and that is where that question of lack of structure comes in. That care then becomes connected to the question of whether I like you or not. So then, in this particular Garima Griha, it was just cited that we don't like this individual. We don't want, she's a troublemaker, and we don't want her to be with us, right? So because we don't have certain structures, impersonal structures in place, therefore it is possible for us to impart care on the basis of friendships, on the basis of affiliations, and on the basis of whether I like you or not. But then the fundamental question is that, should care depend on if I like you? Is it the onus of the disabled trans person? Is it the onus of any person to be a friendly personality so that care can be imparted? So that is that I think that is a very important question for the idea of democracy, and that is also my little critique of the idea of valorization of chosen family in queer and trans spaces. Because the moment we think of the chosen family, I don't think we have developed enough critical language to even think about what are the infrastructures that cohere around this idea of that enable the chosen family. Of course, our caste class privileges, our affiliations, what we like, what we don't like. In trans spaces, sartorial preferences, who is masculine enough, who is feminine enough, who passes, who doesn't pass. There are all these multiple layers of questions, right? Which become important when we think of the chosen family. So if a person is not likable, then that person cannot be part of the chosen family, and therefore that person doesn't deserve care. And so these were a couple of bottlenecks that came up, and that brought up these very generalized questions of how do we think of care, how do we think of services, and how do we think about the right to dignity. Another important point that came up during that has been coming up during this whole episode is that the fact that because we have been having these conversations about the need for creating these structures whereby this particular individual and many like her can continue to receive care, whether we are personally involved or not. So when we are looking for these structures, some of us even approached disability rights groups, which are also connected to several shelter homes and old age homes in West Bengal. Now, the bottleneck that we have been facing here is that, of course, they've been asking for the medical records. And every time I go there, or some of us go there with the medical history of these particular people, the moment the question of HIV comes up, and that becomes a strict no, right? So then, now, it would be simplistic to assume that it is simply a stigma based on the HIV status of a person. It's not that. The thing is that an elderly person is not supposed to be a sexual person, and HIV becomes a signal. It almost signals an active sex life, and so one doesn't really need to get into the nitty-gritty of one's viral load, or whether one is undetectable, or all those details. The very fact of the HIV report is a signal that this person probably has an active sexual life, and if that is the case, how can this person live in this kind of a space whereby you are basically you have to spend your day almost meditating? So if one looks at goes into the further detail of the routines of many of these spaces, they have very strict routines that you wake up at 7:30, you pray for 15 minutes, you line up for breakfast, then you do some meditation, or you go to the playroom, you do some knitting work, you watch TV, you again eat, you make some craft, and so throughout the whole day there is these strict protocols about that are necessary to be able to belong in that space, right? And so there is no space for imagining sex, imagining pleasure, and so every time we go to these spaces, and every time we talk to them, they ask us, will this person be disciplined? Now, we just say that, what do you mean by discipline? No, I mean, if you look at the medical history, we are not sure any longer. So you see how the conversations keep happening in silos, right? In trans spaces, when there is complete lack of access, there is no imagining of access, right? And then in the disability space, there is no imagination of one accessing one's gender in an affirmative manner, which would happen through mutual pleasure, or through finding a partner, maybe in that space or maybe outside. How, as someone, how do we then ethically think of a space where an elderly trans person will find home which is accessible, but accessible not in terms of them being able to access every aspect of the architecture of that space, but also in terms of accessing their own bodies, and accessing pleasure, right? So these questions keep coming up again and again, and that always comes back to that question of this kind of false dichotomy that is created between this question of services and rights, because this food and medicines and shelter is mostly thought in terms of services, that the question of dignity, the question of labor, these questions just go missing. If we start thinking of these services, if we start rethinking this question of services in terms of rights, then perhaps we can imagine those, what Vqueeram was just saying, the impossible, like a space where my trans mother can have as much sex as she wants and also access all the spaces. And right now we don't have that kind of a support system. Oh, and then the Garima Grihas also have CCTV cameras all around, right? So the constant surveillance and policing that happen in these spaces. So then how do we really think of, how do we really imagine these spaces? And finally, just to end on a very tedious, boring, but an important note, are the question of the current, the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act, which has been completely redone, and what it means. It has only increased surveillance further. So non-profits who would even, try and imagine such kind of spaces have to think twice before even imagining them, right? Because because I was just looking at the statistics between 2011 and 2019. FCRE registration certificates of 20,675 NGOs have been cancelled, of which 16,746, like 81%, was during the current government, right? So organizations are also extremely afraid of talking about rights and dignity. In some sense, then thinking of livelihood schemes, livelihood generation, empowerment becomes far more safer to talk about transness, to talk about gender identity. But in that process, these fundamental questions of dignity and rights and demanding the impossible go missing. So then what I want to leave with is this question of how do we really imagine, how do we improvise, and how do we innovate at a time when there is so much surveillance? How do we metaphorically, literally break those CCTV cameras and have rampant sex or access our genders irrespective of our age and irrespective of our abilities and irrespective of these whole Savarna ideas of purity, pollution, touch, non-touch, HIV, non-HIV. That's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Sayan. A really remarkable sets of thoughts. Two really quick things. One, you can hear, right? No audio. Okay, great. One is that I'm thinking about the other seva on which we in Delhi really relied on. And I'm really sorry for saying you were in the first world when you're in Kolkata, which is really not the first world. But I'm thinking about seva because really during the COVID pandemic, had it not been for the Gurdwaras and the associated network of Sikh religiosity and its idea of seva itself, Delhi would have collapsed, right? And so on the one hand, we relied on this kind of other kind of idea of seva, but also we are also seeing the criminalization of some idea of not service, but being like of everyday care when we see the biryani conversation at Shaheen Bagh, right? And so where is the funds for the biryani, etc., coming from? So we're also seeing a kind of increasing surveillance of precisely the non-state forms of care and so on. The other thing that I find I want to push you towards is that when we know this, that when Dr. Ambedkar finally when we finally got the constitution, Dr. Ambedkar famously said that we have political equality, not social equality, right? And so while dignity might be politically viable and can be instituted politically, fraternity, who do we choose to part with, who do we choose to care for, etc., is far more difficult to kind of think about. And it remains one of those things that is actually part of the preamble, but not in the fundamental rights, right? Because you can't really force people to fraternize, right? So I'm thinking about what are the ways in which you want to push us towards fraternity, what can we build up, and not simply repair, right? Because what we tend to think about right now is care as kind of a reparative project of all the harm democracy does to us. And so what might be actually the productive space of care, and where might we push that older conversation about fraternity? I'll stop there with my questions. I'm going to give the audience about 10 minutes to collect a bunch of questions for everyone. And then, because I don't want all of you to be forced to answer the Savarna on the panel. And then we can just kind of take up. We already have, I see 2 hands there, 3, 4, okay, 5. Hey, hello, right wingers. All the questions are coming from the left wing. Shanta first, and then we circle it around.
Thanks. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity, this privilege to learn new things through this journey, through this movement to freedom. I have learned a bit about Savarna, about caste essentialism, which I feel very disconnected from my realities. And also, like, I have also started thinking about remedy. We have talked about gatekeeping, regulation, criminal laws, but what are the remedies? Are we ready to form common remedies to respond to all form of discrimination and all forms of violence? Because we have talked about the problems, the issues, but actually what are the remedies to give a common response to all form of like a violation and all forms of criminal laws? For example, I come from a conflict zone, and why, like, I often feel like why the larger queer community in India are failed to respond to the movement to repeal armed forces versus power act, because our life in the region is like we are tribes to a lot of challenges with or without COVID, with or without criminal laws, because we are prohibited to exercise certain democratic activities and also freedom because of this draconian law. And I, as a person, belong to an indigenous, underrepresented, neglected community and also a marginalized community. I am not safe either, like neither in my own land and also outside the state. So how do we as a responsible community who are, resisting to all form of violence, come up with a common remedy to respond to all form of violence, and why people are very much silent on the movement to repeal armed forces versus power act, when people are very much vocal against CAPE, against the farm law. There were a lot of hues and cry against this, discriminatory law. Then why my own community, queer community across the nation are very much silent on Afasfa? This is my question. And also,
Go ahead.
and also talking about privilege and underprivileged community, in my experience, like what happens, like the funders are also a big players to promote these privileged queer peoples, because the hardcore grassroots trans activists are often left out in the development because we do not have this capacity to write good proposal in English. And also what happens is like these gay peoples, I should say gay peoples, gay privileged peoples, they have got this degree from this institute, and then they will come down to the state, and then there will be overtake our efforts and the work that we have been doing, that we have been creating for all these years long. So we just cannot talk about focus or target the privileged community. We also need to find out what makes them privileged, what promote them to get more privilege in the process of this movement to freedom. Thank you.
ಒಂದು ಪ್ಯಾಂಡಮಿಕ್ ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲಿ, ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಸಮಯದಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಳ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ 2019 ಎಂಡಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಫಂಡ್, ಇದು ಗ್ಲೋಬಲ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಅನ್ನ ನಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರು ಹೇಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಗ್ಲೋಬಲ್ ಫಂಡ್ಗೆ ಅಪ್ಲೈ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಗ್ಲೋಬಲ್ ಫಂಡ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. 2019 ಎಂಡಿಂದನೂ ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಕೇಶನ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, ಸಾತಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ಗ್ಲೋಬಲ್ ಫಂಡ್ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. ಎಲ್ಲಾರ್ಗೂ ಡಿಜಿಟಲ್ ಪೇಮೆಂಟ್ 1500 rupees ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಎಲ್ಲಾರ್ಗು ಅವ್ರ ಅಕೌಂಟ್ ಬರುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ. ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಸ್ಪೆಂಡಿಂಗ್. ಓಕೆ, ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ ನನ್ನ ಜೊತೆ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಇತ್ತು. ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದೀವಿ, ಅಕೌಂಟ್ ಡೀಟೇಲ್ ಸರಿ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ. ನಾವೆಲ್ಲರೂ ಕೂಡ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ ನಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ಕಡೆ ಹೋಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೀವಿ. ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒಂದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಆಧಾರ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು, ಅವ್ರದ್ದು ಕಾಂಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ನಂಬರ್ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು, ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಳ್ಸಿದ್ದಾಯ್ತು. ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ಸರಿ ಒನ್ ಮೋರ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್, ಇನ್ನೊಂದ್ಸರಿ ಥರ್ಡ್ ಟೈಮ್, ಫೋರ್ತ್ ಟೈಮ್ PDF ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ನಾನಂದೆ ನಾನ್ ಕೊಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ, ನೀವು ಹೇಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ತೀರಾ? ನಮ್ಗೇನಾದ್ರೂ ಸ್ಯಾಲ್ರಿ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ದೀರಾ PDF ಕನ್ವರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಕೊಡ್ಲಿಕ್ಕೆ? ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಿಂದ ನಾನು ನನ್ನ ಆರ್ಗನೈಸೇಷನ್ ಇಂದ ಸುಮಾರು 860 ಜನದ್ದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅನ್ನ ಕಳಿಸಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಎಲ್ಲೋಯ್ತು ಅದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್? ಯಾರ್ ರೆಸ್ಪಾನ್ಸಿಬಿಲಿಟಿ ಅದ್ರದ್ದು ಡಾಕ್ಯುಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್? ಇನ್ಫೆಸಮ್ ಕಡೆಯಿಂದ ನಾವು ಸಬ್ಮಿಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಅವರು ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಸಾತಿಗೆ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು. ನಾವು ಬಂದು ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿಗೆ ಕೊಟ್ಟಿದ್ವಿ, ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಫೈ ಮಾಡ್ತು ಇದು ಆಗೋದಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಬಿಟ್ರು. ನಮ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್ ಅಲ್ಲ, ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್, ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್. ಯು ಗೋ ಅಂಡ್ ಫೈಟ್ ದಟ್, ಐಡೆಂಟಿಫೈ ಗುಡ್ ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಅಲ್ಲ ಅವರು ಸಾತಿ ಅವರು ಗುಡ್ ಏಜೆನ್ಸಿನ ಐಡೆಂಟಿಫೈ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು. ₹1 ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿಗೆ ಬಂದು ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಫರ್ ಆಗಿದೆ, ಅದು ಕೌಡಿನ? ಅದು ಕೌಡಿನ ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ? ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು ಹಾಗಾದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ ಪ್ರಕಾರ? ಮೊನ್ನೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ 2 days ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಇತ್ತು, ನಾನು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ರೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ, ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ. 1 month ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅಮೌಂಟ್ ಕೊಡೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು, ನೀವು ಅಮೌಂಟ್ ಕೊಡ್ಲಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಕೇಸ್ ಹಾಕ್ತೀನಿ. ಏನಂತಂದ್ರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರು ಹೇಳಿ ನೀವು ಫಂಡ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿರೋದು, ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಹೆಸರು ಹೇಳಿ ನೀವು ಫಂಡ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿರೋದು, ರೈಟ್ ಟು ಇನ್ಫಾರ್ಮೇಶನ್ ಹಾಕಿ ಎಲ್ಲ ತಗೊಂಡು ಎಷ್ಟು ಫಂಡ್ ಬಂತು, ಏನ್ ಕತೆ, ಏನ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರಿ ಅಂತ ನೀವು ನನಗೆ ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ರೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ವಿ. ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಬಾಯ್ಕಾಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ, ನಿಮ್ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ನಾವು ಬರೋದಿಲ್ಲ. ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು ಹುಡುಗಾಟ ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ನಾವ್ ಅಷ್ಟೊಂದು ಚೀಪ್ ಆಗಿದೀವಾ? ನಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರಲ್ಲಿ ದುಡ್ಡು ತಗೊಂಡಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ನಮ್ಗೆ ನೀವು ಕೊಡ್ಬೇಕು ಅಂತೇಳಿ. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಬಂದಿದ್ದು, ಇಲ್ಲ ಹಾಗ್ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಡಿ, ನೀವೇನ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಗ್ರಾಸರಿ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ದು. ಸರ್ ಗ್ರಾಸರಿ ಸರಿ, ಓಕೆ, 860 ಜನ ಡಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್, ಎಲ್ಲಾ ಡಿಸ್ಟಿಕ್ ಇಂದಾನು ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದೀನಿ. ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ you are always know what is community, what peoples are going to blame us, we know everybody. ಓಕೆನಾ? ಸೊ ಈ ತರ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ, ನೀವು ಕೊಡಿದ್ದು 500 ಗ್ರಾಸರಿ ಕಿಟ್ ಕೊಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರು. ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಡನ್. ಓಕೆನಾ? ಎಸ್ಟರ್ಡೇ ಮೀಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡುವಾಗ ನಿಮಗೆ ಪರ್ಸನಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಫೋನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವಿ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಇನ್ನೂ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ. ನಾನು ಯಾಕೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಕಮ್ಯುನಿಟಿಗೆ ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ಪ್ರಾಬ್ಲಮ್. ವಿ ಕಾಂಟ್ ರೈಟ್ ಗುಡ್ ಪ್ರಪೋಸಲ್, ವಿ ಡೋಂಟ್ ನೋ, ವಿ ಆರ್ ಇನ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರೀಟ್. बट थोड़ा लोग ऑर्गेनाइजेशन है, हमारा नाम बोल के फंड लेते हैं, अच्छा तरीका काम नहीं करता है. वही है मेरा सवाल. वही मतलब ऐसा एक प्रॉब्लम है, कोविड का बारे में ऐसा प्रॉब्लम है. और एक बात है कम्युनिटी का सक्सेसफुल का बात है, बम्बई में जो है नायक है, वो नायक लोग कोविड का टाइम पे दूसरा जनरल पॉपुलेशन को जो रेशन किट दिया, बेंगलुरु में भी रेशन कार्ड दिया, हम भी दिया. थोड़ा सीनियर पर्सन पैसा रहने वाला भी है, वैसा खाना 2-3 महीने का कंटिन्यूसली स्लम एरिया में खाना लेने की होटल पे बुक किया. ऐसा सक्सेसफुल स्टोरी भी हमारा पास है. मतलब एक ही बात है, लैंग्वेज का बहुत प्रॉब्लम है, बहुत जन का फोबिया, ट्रांसफोबिया सारा जन को भी है. ओके, वो छोड़ना है पहले. और एक बात है, हम पूरा ट्रांस पर्सन है, हम जो इधर बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होता है, क्लास कास्ट बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट होता है. मतलब किसको इंग्लिश मालूम है वो लोग का प्रॉब्लम नहीं है. प्राइड बोले तो वो क्रॉस ड्रेस करके ऐसा कवर क्या क्या के करके आ रहा है. मतलब रोड पे लड़ने वाले हम हैं, हम भीख मांगने वाले हम हैं. सेक्स वर्क करने का टाइम पे जो पुलिस आके हमको पकड़ता है, पैसे रहने वाले के कुछ नहीं होता है. वो 5 स्टार होटल में, 3 स्टार होटल में वो जो रूम बुक करके वो जाके करते हैं. वो प्रॉब्लम नहीं है. हम जेंडर इश्यू के बारे में लड़ना है, हम ट्रांस राइट्स के बारे में लड़ना बोले तो सब जन भी आना है. काली प्राइड को आ रहे हैं, अम्मा जोड़ी जोड़ी आ रहा है, कपल्स आ रहा है, ड्रेस कर रहे हैं, मेकअप कर रहे हैं, जा रहे हैं. वो क्या फायदा है हमको? वही है हमारा सवाल है. कभी भी हम फ्राइड करते हैं ना, फ्राइड का दिन आ रहा है, सब लोग आ रहे हैं, डिजाइन वेराइटी आ रहे, बहुत यंगे जा रहे हैं, मेकअप करके कास्ट्यूम डाल के. हम कभी भी देखो, अरविंदर इधर बैठ को है, हम 20 साल का पहले से हम लड़ रहे, हमको राइट चाहिए. आवाज हमारे क्या आवाज है, मीडिया में आ रहे, सब कुछ मीडिया के साथ कौन भी आके बात नहीं करते है. हम बात करते हैं, हम मिडिल क्लास है, हम स्ट्रीट में ये बात करते हैं. वो इतना का थिंकिंग क्यों आपको नहीं है? आपको एजुकेशन है बाबा, हम एग्री करते हो. मतलब आप आओ, बैठो, लड़ो हमारा साथ, ये सब पूरा काम करना है. थैंक यू.
Okay. Okay, Chandani spoke very too many things. She is focusing on the one of the grant which was applied for with the Global Fund. GFATM, basically to provide COVID relief support for trans and other sexual minority communities. She's saying that Sati, she mentioned the name, so I'm taking. Collecting documents of these communities, basically the bank account and other documents, and repeatedly it has been collected, but nothing has come to reach to the community. And first time, second time, third time. Now recently they have asked for the documents in PDF. They're testing the patience of the. It's not the problem with the community, but it's the problem with the agency. That is what the reason what has been mentioned. So then promising of giving some dry ration kit of about 500. So I think there is a lack of transparency what she's talking about, and there's a need that this need to be this has to be dealt with these organizations, because in the name of the community the organizations are seeking funds, and then we have because we are not so privileged and we don't have English background skills where we cannot afford for these kind of grants. But when these organizations, the INGOs and the NGOs, when they apply for these grants, I think there is a lack of transparency, and there's a need to file some RTIs to find out more details about this. And regarding, she says that we have seen, of course, we mingle with all kind of upper class communities, because for our rights, it is important that we need to go get along together. But it's important that we are the one who actually we will be on the forefront. We shout for our rights, and we are the one who actually face all the consequences, all the situations, our day-to-day situations in this struggle for identity. But the upper class people, they come only for pride. They doing all sort of decorations. They come in couples and they celebrate. But somewhere, because we don't have the skills, that she stopped. I mean, she actually touched upon those points. With your permission, I want to add one more point for what Shanta said. That somewhere we have lot of experience. In fact, many people are here. Arvind, Jayana, everybody are here. In Bangalore, there is a culture that we actually collaborate, we build solidarity, we build alliances with other movements. Where you were talking about Armed Forces Special Power Act, we from the last 10 decades we are on that struggle. Basically, we have showed solidarity with the Northeast communities, earlier with Jammu and Kashmir, but now the AFPA has been removed from there. So I'm just saying that, and it's very important that we need to collaborate with other movements to counter the situation, the threats, what the civil society organization, I won't say civil society organization, I will say the movement-based organizations are currently facing. And the spaces for human rights is really shrinking in India. Rightly said, in the last decade now, we have seen a lot of ups and downs. I think there's a need for the community to get into the mainstream politics is also very important to bring the larger changes, I believe. Maybe I want Pushpesh, Dr. Pushpesh, and the panel should basically to say something on this. Thank you.
Kanmani, really quickly, Christy, and we wrap up with those questions, and quickly then the panel can respond to whatever they think.
This is mainly thanks to Vikram's teaching around ITPA that I can ask this question. That I wanted to mainly ask, when you talk about punitive and the implied kind of punitive, right? I mean, now anti-trafficking bill is going to be tabled in this session, they're saying. So now Transact is there and we are legalized, but in the same, like this thing through ITPA, majority of trans sex workers will be also criminalized. We're already criminalized. It will be just even more further in different mechanisms. So I wanted to know your thoughts on that. That's it. And thanks for the amazing time.
Thank you to all the panelists. The conversation was really amazing. My question is somewhere in lines with what Santa and आपका नाम Chandni mentioned. Primarily, what is issues? This is every queer Azadi March, Mumbai में मतलब that discussion is there कि queer issue क्या है? Like the moment we try to bring in AFSPA, or the moment we try to bring in issue like Adivasi issues happening in Bastar, it doesn't become a queer issue. I'm not able to understand, comprehend how this is not a queer issue. How does not affect or influence or is related with queer lives there. Then yeah, so again the other, it's again relatable questions within movement spaces also, like it's democracy is kind of missing, as in it just becomes like whoever is more in number or whoever can make the more noise per se. This question is primarily how come 377 became an umbrella issue where for the queer community to band together, but transgender bill failed per se. Like it was just transgender persons coming and voicing out concerns. And this I'm talking from my lived experience with Queer Azadi March. It was a task for us to get them release a statement. It was just a statement. They could have done way more than that. Then yeah, so the other thing is like related again. When we talk of movement spaces also, Hidme Markham's name, it is so difficult to hear Hidme's name. And Soni Suri, she's trying to bring how to say, advocate, not exactly advocate, push for people to talk about Hidme, and so that she can get released from jail. But it is still, I'm feeling it is becoming an echo chamber because people are not listening and not taking it up. Whereas I'm like, we need to talk about all activists who are state ने जिन लोगों को मतलब जेल पे और ये लॉ UAPA को गलत तरीके से यूज किया है. But within that circle also, there are certain identities which are again sidelined. So yeah, like movement के अंदर भी किस हद तक democracy काम कर रही है, sort of question.
Last question to Grace Banu.
Hey, I also
Okay. अरे फिर जल्दी decide. हाँ. Swati, keep it short.
Yes, very short. So see, when it comes to the democracy, I totally agree with what Shanta says, because it is very problematic when we raise any kind of democratic issues in the Northeast. We are being guided by the NAFSA Act, And secondly, when in this present scenario, each and everyone is raising questions or any act, whichever is been getting passed by the parliament are being challenged in the constitutionality before the Supreme Court, but no one is taking any kind of steps towards AFSA, where we have been already guided by. And secondly, the main thing is that on the other hand, the question is of AFSA. And on the second thing, when it talks about democracy, we are again being thrown out by the NRC process. And recently, even you see, when we challenged it through an intervention application, and the last CGI, what he told me in the open court is, you guys have missed. We might have missed the bus, but trains and flights are available, right? So even though they were unable to accommodate us in that. So these are some of the things, and what the Chandni has raised is very an important thing, because what we see in the queer pride, the gender queer and queer are being collabed together, because the person whom we saw to be a gay, now they are also trans. So it is something like transgender for benefits, And when even in the Mumbai queer pride, when I ask some of them, I won't take their name, but they are quite privileged, in the Mumbai community sector. So when I asked them, what the reply I got is, and I was quite astonished to see their reply is, they are freelance trans. So can you just imagine when we talks about democracy and someone is talking about the gender identity can also be a freelance. So that is something what we also have to think of, because because otherwise, if it continue to grow like this, we will be marginalized within the marginalized community. So that is what we see democracy as, being a community member.
Great. Ayo.
So, yeah.
Just quickly,
Yes.
really quickly, because
So when
I don't want some plate thrown at me.
yes, the intersectionality issues, we don't focus on that. For example, the person with a disability and the below 18 gender non-conforming children's and gender non-binary children's and the people who are identify themselves as a trans, queer on the between 18. So we have to talk about those kind of people also, and I need a command about that. And yes, as Chandini said, the intersectionality issues. So we should focus on that. And obviously, more when we talk about the marginal community, talk about the rights-based issues. Most of the time, the Savarna, queer persons, and all the people who are having privilege, those people are now keeping their silence. And for example, when we talk about the horizontal reservation for the trans, and they are thinking now it's for the Dalit people issues, it's for the Adivasi people issues, it's for the the Bahujan, the Muslim community issues. So they are they didn't even say anything. They're always keeping silence. So yeah. So
Umi, really quickly, and that's it. Then, I mean, the panel also. Umi last.
ನಾವು ಡೆಮೋಕ್ರಸಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿರ್ಬೇಕಾದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಹೊರಗಡೆ ಡೆಮೋಕ್ರಸಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆನೂ ನಾವು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ರೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಿದೀವಿ. ಒಂದು ಲೆವೆಲ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಜೆಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದು ಅಥವಾ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಜೆಂಡರ್ ಏನು ನಾಸ ಜಡ್ಜ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಈ ತರ ಸುಮಾರು ವಿಚಾರಗಳು ನಮಗೆ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಇಂಟರ್ನಲ್ ಡೆಮೋಕ್ರಸಿ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಾವು ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ, ಇವತ್ತು ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಜೆಂಡರ್ಸ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಡಿಸೈಡ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಥವಾ ಏನಾದ್ರೂ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟಿಗಳಾಗಬೇಕು ಅಥವಾ ಡಿಸಿಷನ್ಸ್ ಆಗಬೇಕು ಅಂತ ಬಂದಾಗ, ಎಲ್ಲೋ ಒಂದು ಡೆಲ್ಲಿ ಲೆವೆಲ್ಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಕುತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಲೋಕಲ್ ಬೇರೆ ಬೇರೆ ರಾಜ್ಯಗಳ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಮಾತಾಡೋವಂಥದ್ದು ಮತ್ತೆ ಡಿಸಿಷನ್ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋವಂಥದ್ದು ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ, ಅದು ತುಂಬಾ ಅನ್ಡೆಮೋಕ್ರೆಟಿಕ್ ಪ್ರೋಸೆಸ್ ಇದೆ. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಈಗ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಶೆಲ್ ಇರ್ಬಹುದು, ಮತ್ತೆ ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್ ಇರ್ಬೋದು, ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನಾವು ನೋಡೋದಾದ್ರೆ ಇವತ್ತಿಗೂ ಕೂಡ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕದಲ್ಲಿ ಶೆಲ್ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಏನು ಸರಿಯಾಗಿ ಮಾಹಿತಿ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಮತ್ತೆ ವಾಟ್ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಡಿಸ್ಕಸಿಂಗ್, ಹೌ ದೇ ಆರ್ functioning, all these things we don't know, because we are also Indians, we are also representing as a Karnataka. But where is the democracy is my question.
So what Umi is saying, we are discussing about democracy for many years, and of course, because of the collective, the democratic approach, we were able to succeed quite a bit. She's talking about the TG Act and the NALSA judgment she's talking about. But what about the internal democracy? There's a gap in the internal democracy. The decisions are taken arbitrarily at the national level on behalf of the entire country without having proper discussion and consultation. I think those decisions are not taking the entire other states together. I think that is something which is very important and critical. Particularly, she talks about the TG cell and the TG council. We don't know what discussions are happening and what are the findings, basically. I think this is a very critical issue. Taking people together, it's very important.
Each of the panelists has about 3 minutes each to say. Maybe we start Pushpesh, and then Kunal, then Kris, and finally Sayan. Anything you feel like.
Yeah. Is it working?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the first thing you said about that why we should talk about a privileged queer kind of a thing. I just give an analogy here. When the Telangana movement was going on for a separate state of Telangana, then a lot of Hijra people were mobilized, to clap against the Andhra people who were not trying to, who were talking about a united Andhra, not a separate Telangana. Their energies were used. And then when the Telangana was formed, so women were asking to the state, to the government, what is there for women? Muslims, minorities are asking, what is there for Muslims? And then Hijra people were also asking, what is there for the Hijra? So I think something happened or not, but it allowed the community to come together and mobilize. And that mobilizational energy goes into different directions and translates into various things. The trajectory of which we can map out and cannot be exactly mapped out, but it has its own significance. So I think that when the privileged queer and the gay constituency or whatever, they have also used the energy of, as my sister is saying, the Hijra community, the trans community. Then there is a question need to be asked. And there was a lot of writing during the COVID period that what is the responsibility of the upwardly mobile middle class towards the working class? And this is the right time and right context to ask about it. So we have to raise the question. We have to create a guilt. We have to theorize the guilt. We have to push the guilt to the and foreground guilt within the movement. I think that is also one thing which we need to think through, and we need to theorize this guilt and how to instill guilt in the mind of people, those who try to articulate some kind of innocence. Now they have got the civil rights. Now they're innocent. So this innocency is a criminal act. We have to talk about that and theorize that. Second thing about APSPA, I would say, as Santa is talking about, and you also asked me to respond. What happened? This is a larger project, and how we have to understand, and many people have tried to engage with it. Many scholars also that state agamben, for example, state creates the government or the state creates the state of exceptionalism. So whenever you're talking about roti kapra or makan, the basic livelihood question, the state will say there is some insurgency in Kashmir or some insurgency in Northeast. That becomes an arm in the hand of the state, to exaggerate that and deflect your attentions from the real issues. And this is how, and that translates into a very nationalistic kind of sentiment. And that gets entrenched into the through media and other ways in the popular side, and it becomes a part of a common sense of the larger majority in this country, and then it becomes very difficult to fight. And the queer also participate in that kind of sentimentalization and nationalism and all that. So as you said, as queer group, queer movement, we have to bring this into the forefront, even at the risk. The queer movement has to be a risk-taking enterprise. And a lot of people are, incarcerated. And as Kris is an example, we have to take that risk, and we have to galvanize the movement in terms of the language of risk taking, and also the movement as I could not get your name. What is your name?
Chandni.
Chandni, yeah. So Chandni is talking about, she's asking. So I think the priority of the movement has to be defined, privileged, and foregrounded through the perspective of the most marginalized within the group. That we have to bring to the forefront and foreground in the movement. And unless and until we foreground that in the movement, we all are guilty, and we all have to own the guilt. So guilt is something I want to push in this forum. Kunal.
Right. Very quickly. So I want to respond to you. You talked about this politics of limits of a democracy based on sight, and you're absolutely right. In fact, I would say the law loves to see, the law loves to watch and ogle. And this is an idea, especially in the criminal law, when we've talked about the panopticon and the idea that the law can observe you in every minute detail, can govern every minute detail. And Unfortunately, our dominant ideas of democracy or a democratic setup or a legal setup are based on this. That this is what the law will govern, what it sees, and that is a justifiable site for the law to govern. And of course, the moment you move beyond sight, you have to make an effort at understanding. You have to make an effort at empathy. And that is absolutely missing. So you're absolutely right. This is a democracy mostly based on sight. It is a democracy that reacts to things that it sees rather than tries to understand, accommodate, or whatever word one might want to use for it. And that's very much in the nature of our punitive law as well. Law is punitive. It aims to punish and punish only as its logical end when it just reacts. So let's say we see a horrible crime, our immediate impulse, which unfortunately is also a legal impulse today, is to just react with violence towards it and to otherize the accused, the criminal, etc. So that's what we are doing. On the implied punitiveness, that's the point really. You see a law which at least has to now pay lip service to the language of rights, and therefore does that, and it couches that legislation, which is also in some senses, we don't have time for it, but is also a form of regulation, but it couches it in the terms of rights or in the language of rights. But as silently and by implication, it also in a sense pulls the rug from under your feet. But you can never challenge it, because in theory they are totally towards and geared towards giving you the rights. This is the politics of duplicity. This is what we are seeing in Kashmir with the revocation of 370, that you see this grand statement of development, this that of a project of which claims several constituencies, but ultimately you also know that by implication a lot of things are taken away, permanently revoked. So this is a politics of duplicity. You see it with the trafficking bill, you see it with everything, and that's what legal regulation is more often than not. But I'll stop.
Thank you. So, I don't know how to respond to what you said, but that is true, right? It is a democracy of exceptional, especially, and I kind of relate it to tokenism as such, because we exceptional in terms of catering to a cisgender, heterosexual, upper caste gaze, and a person, a transgender person, or a person that is an exception who is able to cater to that gaze, then becomes the exceptional, who then becomes the poster person, and democracy around that, right? So that is where we are. That's I don't know. Another thing, when we're talking about services and dignity, I just had this thought where the way we have the Trans Act itself is kind of, you can see it from the perspective of service. Because if you've been asking for rights for such a long time, we've done you the service of giving you this exception-based act, which is a service, and it says, हाँ आप बोल रहे हो कि आपके against discrimination हो रहा है, आप बोल रहे हो कि आपको एजुकेशन प्रॉब्लम हो रहा है, ये पॉलिसी है, उसका क्या होगा नहीं पता, which itself is, I'm seeing it as a service perspective. And lastly, now that the whole Christy and Swati has also brought in the point of the Bombay queer thing, the risk of being controversial. So the thing is that, right, as you said, this freelance trans thing. So this is something that started 2 years ago, where, so the thing is, with the history of how queer organizing in Bombay has been, with the last at least 10 to 20 years, there's been a monopoly of these service-based cis queer people who had funds and the privilege and have been visible for that. When any kind of when recently the movement has been where we are able to organize trans people outside of it, or young queer people outside of it, we've been given this thing that you're using the trans card, you have no experience in this, who are you, how dare you say, how dare you hold stage, who are you, what have you done, you can't play your trans card everywhere. Which is where the whole mocking and literal bullying, where misuse of pronouns, where cis gay men were using, now you have to call me your highness because these are my pronouns. So that kind of harassment and bullying of trans people, especially young trans people, is also online, was happening, which is the kind of context of where that Bombay thing comes from. And that is the point, right? And as Chandni also said, with these non-profits, etc., not non-profits, okay, sorry. With these certain organizations, they have access, they have privilege from that location, they have access and a lot of funds that they are getting, and they are being misused. They've been even in Bombay, they're being used, saying that we are working with the CBOs, we are working for trans sex workers. File an RT, I am sure that's not the case. So that's the point, right? That is where it ties in. And that's what, right? There was an umbrella sense when it was 377. It was on the backs of trans people. 377 is gone. That's not happening. So it kind of ties to the question that Christy also had. But it comes from the recognition of that service-based, where that is given platform, that was given risk. But as trans people and a trans democracy, are we able to organize beyond that? Better, maybe.
Sorry, there was a little lag, so I was just following the live stream video. I don't have much to say. I don't want to hold you from your lunch. What Vqueeram said about radical equality, and a lot to think about it. Just a couple of things, a couple of sentences. Personally, pride doesn't excite me, and I'm not really invested in pride. If there was a march of shame, then that is something that I would be interested in, to be involved in the organizing. In 2019, during the NRC protests, the way trans people, particularly Hijras, were really at the forefront of a lot of the organizing and at the forefront of the marches that happened here in Kolkata and its suburbs. If that is not pride, what is? But then but connected and its suburbs, if that is not pride, what is? But then but connected to that is the question is what happens after that? Where do the conversations go after that initial moment of solidarity? So that continuous work of forging conversations across impossibilities is what is perhaps the imaginary of that radical equality. And so then who is the subject of right? Who is the subject of law? And that is where that question of the elderly simply goes missing. I don't think we have enough conversations on that. And many of these people were really at the forefront of the movement in the various movements, sex workers movements on, blood donors movements, radical left movements. They were at the forefront of these movements. They were part of organizing. And right now, because they don't have these capacitated, bodies and body minds, therefore become easily disposable. So then, how do we really? What rights are we talking about if we cannot imagine rights and equality that takes into account various body minds? Yeah, that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
So where do we go after this? Lunch. And thereafter maybe to another conversation. We are breaking for lunch for 45 minutes. 3:15. Please, before you get up, could we have a round of applause to the stunning panel that we had? And again, thank you to all the organizers for organizing food for us. It is upstairs at the terrace. Mansi, any other announcement?
If someone wants to take the lift, it's at the end of this corridor, and our interns will direct you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Vqueeram.
Stunning. Very good. I told you all this was like you doing drama. Rubbish. I knew it.